Hey, everybody. It is Monday, January 27th. You're listening to the Mo News podcast on this Monday. I'm Mo Schwanunu.
And I'm Jill Wagner. This is the place where we bring you just the facts.
And we read all the news and read between the lines so you don't have to. Jill, today marks 1 week of the Trump presidency. And I have to say, it's been a very long year.
Yeah, well, with 20-something executive orders within the first 24 hours, he already has spoken to the press and taken more media questions than President Biden did in a year, even more.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's non-stop news, 24/7.
And then he went across the country on Friday. He's rescinded more than 70 of the Biden orders. There are a number of big conversations, tariff threats happening with the Danes, with the Colombians. We'll try to get into as much as we can here. We've been trying to keep up on the Mo News Premium Instagram account this weekend. And doing our best here to try to distinguish between the things that are just rhetoric, the things that can actually be done. I think it's important that nuance is important because otherwise, I just keep getting notes from people being like, can this happen? Can this happen? Can this happen? Can this happen? I was like, well, that depends. That requires Congress. That requires a constitutional amendment, yada, yada, yada. So there's a lot going on here. And we should note that we're going to make a point here over the next couple days, weeks, months, years to try to cover a variety of headlines, not just focus everything on Washington. We know that, there's a lot of interest out there and things happening around the world that don't necessarily have to do with politics. We actually put out a premium pod over the weekend with a friend of mine, author and journalist Juan Williams. He's out with a new book looking at the state of civil rights and race in America, looking at what he calls the second civil rights movement, which he marks the Obama convention speech in Boston in 2004 is kind of the beginning of that through BLM. We look at the lessons of that, good and bad. I think he has a very honest portrayal. Got some great feedback about it over the weekend. Again, that's over on the Premium podcast. They get all podcast interviews first, and then that'll eventually trickle out this week over on the Mo News interview pod. So we will continue to cover politics. We'll cover politics adjacent items, as well as just, everything. Try to hit all the major things happening beyond politics in our world.
And Moshe, I think you make a really good point to talk about the noise versus the substance, because I have a bunch of friends who are very, very concerned about this Trump administration. And I have a lot of people messaging me as well on social media, really worried, like genuinely concerned. And I have said to them, be specific. Like, what are the things that you're specifically really stressed about? And let's go through them and talk about them. And for example, the idea of Trump having a third term or never leaving office. Yeah. Noise, not going to happen. We have a constitution. So that's one of those things where it's like, don't lose sleep over that. If you don't like Donald Trump and you think
which is like, almost 80 million Americans who voted against him, right?
Right. I mean, there are real things and real issues we should talk about. There are other things that, to your point, are just noise. Yeah.
And we should note there is a congressman from Tennessee who happens to be being investigated right now by the FBI, who happened to put forth a constitutional amendment that would allow Trump to serve a third term, specifically Trump, because he wrote in a way where he's like, if you serve 2 terms in office, not immediately consecutively after each other, you get a right to a third term. So that means like Obama wouldn't, Bush wouldn't, Clinton wouldn't. But bottom line is to get a constitutional amendment across, you need 2/3 of Congress plus 38 states need to do that. Anyway, bottom line is that ain't happening. And by the way, it's not just people who are critical of Trump. I'll note this, I will get notes from people who are very gung-ho on Trump, very excited about what he's doing. And they're like, why won't you report this? And I'm like, well, that technically isn't happening, or that isn't new, or that requires X, Y, and Z to happen. So I think whether you're really excited about some of the headlines coming out, whether you're really concerned about some of the headlines coming out, we will do our best here to dive into them and give you a reality check. Again, whether you are a liberal, a Harris voter, a Trump critic who's really worried, or just like really excited about Trump and curious about how real or how significant various announcements are. And I should add, significant things are happening, right? Some of these announcements are really significant, are really impactful, and some of these just make for a good headline and aren't actually going to happen. So there is, everyone who is interested in this subject matter, for wherever they come from politically, there is a reason to, follow these headlines, but it is also important to draw some nuance there and parse out, actually, this could have a huge impact, or this isn't going anywhere.
Well said. Okay, with that, let's get to some headlines here. Starting with U.S. politics, Donald Trump's controversial pick for Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth ever so narrowly was confirmed on Friday night after Vice President Vance was called into the Senate to cast a tie-breaking vote. We're going to take a look at the top priorities that he's laid out for the Defense Department and give you a look ahead at some of the other precarious Senate confirmation hearings this week. Onto the Middle East, some details about the hostage and prisoner exchange between Israel and Hamas over the weekend. Plus, Donald Trump weighs in on the future of Gaza and the region. Also, the CIA now says that COVID-19 more likely to have originated from a lab leak than spread through animals. And the White House is reportedly in talks to have the computer technology company Oracle and U.S. investors take over TikTok. And the AFC and NFC championships are done and dusted. We now know which two teams will face off in the Super Bowl. Plus, Moshe is on this day in history.
Jill will do a little Super Bowl history on this day in history. And we'll also note today is International Holocaust Remembrance Day.
All right, it was a busy weekend in Washington. Late Friday night, Vice President J.D. Vance cast the tie-breaking vote to confirm President Trump's defense secretary pick, Pete Hegseth. There were some major questions on whether or not he was going to get through, and it came down to the wire. All 47 Democrats and 3 Republicans voted against his nomination because of concerns over what they see as his lack of management qualifications, his controversial views about women not belonging in combat. He says he has changed his mind in recent weeks. And then there is Hegseth's past conduct, including allegations of sexual assault and excessive drinking while leading other organizations. The 3 Republican defectors were Senators Susan Collins of Maine, Mitch McConnell of Kentucky, and Lisa Murkowski of Alaska. Collins and Murkowski came out against Hegseth on Thursday, as we had reported last week on the podcast. But by Friday, McConnell, who is now out of leadership and doing his own thing, said that he would vote against Hegseth as well. In a statement after the vote, McConnell said that the defense secretary is the most important position in the cabinet, managing nearly 3 million military and civilian personnel. There's an annual budget of nearly $1 trillion. And that, in his opinion, and because of all of that, he says Hegseth failed to pass the test necessary to hold the seat. With 50 senators voting for him and 50 senators voting against Hegseth, Vice President Vance had to break the tie. He confirmed Hegseth, which means he is now the defense secretary. The vice president has a ceremonial role as the president of the Senate, where, among other things, they break ties. Yeah, it's one of the few things the VP actually in the Constitution is able to do. Harris broke a number of ties because that was a 50-50 Senate. And going back, we have seen a few of these, but never, as you mentioned, for defense secretary. In fact, for cabinet secretary, this is only the second ever time that the VP has had to break a tie in order to get a cabinet secretary through. The first time actually happened during Trump's first term. That was Betsy DeVos, education secretary. Mike Pence at the time had to break a tie to get her through. Typically, these defense secretaries, looking at recent history, are sometimes confirmed 99-1, 100-0, pretty unanimous. They try typically presidents, including Trump in his first term, to nominate folks that have large bipartisan appeal, given the importance of the role. Again, $1 trillion budget, Defense Department, Pentagon, troops around the world, dealing with war zones 24/7. And typically presidents have wanted someone in that seat that commands the respect of both sides. So this is pretty controversial. Hegseth was almost pulled as a nominee in December, was able to recover here and then just kind of get through. Notably, over the weekend, J.D. Vance saying, when we win a national championship with sports teams that we like, we don't think about the score or how they won. It's just that they won. And so that's the way that he was framing the Hegseth approval here. Hegseth will go into work today at the Pentagon with a major
challenge before him. Now, keep in mind, he does have Army National Guard experience. He did have experience in Iraq and abroad, but there were many questions in terms of just his overall management experience, given just the scope and size of DOD, as well as the various allegations in regards to drinking and his personal life. The McConnell decision to go against here is interesting. Notable. McConnell and Trump do not get along. And now that McConnell's not in leadership anymore, I've sort of joked he's entered his John McCain Maverick era where he'll sort of do his own thing. And his vote will be pivotal here because Collins and Murkowski have faced primary threats from the right before and have survived them. They tend to kind of do their own thing as centrists. Now you have McConnell potentially joining the group. So that's 3, which means you have a number of other nominees coming through here. And if those 3 basically are already a crew against Hegseth, it takes one more to bring down any nominee moving forward here. And so that'll be something we'll watch here. We'll discuss in just a moment.
After his confirmation, Hegseth laid out 3 priorities for the Department of Defense. 1, to revive the warrior ethos and restore trust in our military. 2, to strengthen the nation's industrial base and streamline the military's processes for buying new weapons. And 3, to strengthen our ability to confront the rising military threat of China and end current wars responsibly. A day after Hegseth's confirmation on Saturday, Kristi Noem also confirmed to Trump's cabinet she is the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. That vote was by a comfortable margin, 59-34. Several Democrats actually joined Republicans there. The former Congresswoman and 2-term South Dakota governor will head Trump's plan for mass deportation, cracking down on undocumented immigrants. Sources told reporters that ICE field offices were told to meet a quota of 75 arrests per day. Those raids have already started across the country, including a much anticipated blitz in Chicago. That started Sunday, and we are watching those headlines as there's a lot of confusion and fear around the country regarding these crackdowns on immigrants.
Yeah, there was a separate headline out of Chicago on Friday where the headline came out that a school pushed back on ICE agents. They were trying to raid the school. It turned out they weren't ICE agents, but Secret Service officers who happened to also belong to the Department of Homeland Security, investigating a threat that a student apparently made at the school. But it spoke to just the overall fear there. There were a lot of headlines out there that we had to clarify on our premium account over the weekend. Also, various headlines when it comes to deportation flights. The fact that late last week, they have now enlisted the military. That's going to be something Pete Hegseth deals with, is the military is involved here in these deportations, given the resources or lack thereof that ICE has, the DHS has, so they're bringing in the military. And there was a notable thing transpired over the weekend in regards to Colombia. Some of you might have heard about this if you've been following us on the premium account. The country of Colombia, the president of Colombia, refused to accept 2 U.S. military planes deporting illegal immigrants over the weekend. It set off a furious reaction from President Trump, who announced a barrage of tariffs on Colombia, sanctions on Colombia. We should note Colombia has been the top U.S. ally for the U.S. in Latin America, but they elected a leftist president in recent years, so it has made things more challenging. So what happened here? Well, the U.S. has been deporting folks that they have been rounding up illegally. The focus so far has mainly been on illegal immigrants in the U.S., several hundred thousand of whom have criminal records. And so they're in the process of conducting those raids and deporting them. And that included apparently 2 planefuls of Colombians. They apparently got approval for landing rights in advance. The planes took off, went towards Colombia, and then the Colombian president last second said, nope, turn those planes around. They will not be allowed to land here in Colombia. Apparently, he was very upset that they were not sent on commercial jets, but on military C-17s, military flights. The Brazilians also upset about this. They feel that their citizens are being treated inappropriately. Now, the Trump administration perspective is these people are here illegally, and we will send them back on whatever planes we have. And so ultimately, they reject these planes. The planes have to turn around, go back to Florida. Then Trump takes to social media. He says the U.S. is now going to impose a 25% tariff or tax on all goods coming from Colombia. What do we get from Colombia? Oil, coffee, flowers. In fact, a lot of our cut flowers and roses come from Colombia. He said he would raise them to 50%, so upset about the rejection of the planes. The Colombian president that takes to social media responds, says, "You're treating our citizens inappropriately. We will now impose tariffs on the U.S. The U.S. sells some goods, including oils, as well as plane parts and planes to the Colombians." But then within an hour, the Colombian president was like, "Actually, I'm going to send my presidential jet to pick up the deportees and bring them back." So for those of you watching this all unfold, we're recording this late on Sunday night. It's unclear whether the tariffs will actually be imposed here, but Trump very upset about this. This was going to be the first sort of tariffs that he launches here. The Colombians sort of relenting, the president relenting despite trash talking back to Trump here on social media. But this just one of the various thread lines that we're going to be watching here when it comes to all things immigration, tariffs. And so we'll track this story on Instagram today and throughout the week on the podcast.
Meanwhile, it's going to be a big week ahead for other confirmations on Capitol Hill as the Trump administration looks to fill key positions. Some of the most controversial nominees will face confirmation hearings this week. On Wednesday, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. will sit for what is sure to be a very contentious hearing to lead Health and Human Services. He has critics on the left and the right. He would oversee the nation's healthcare system, including public health agencies like the CDC and the FDA, if he's confirmed. He is a controversial choice for his anti-establishment views, including being critical of vaccine mandates and other public health initiatives. Lawmakers are also worried about his limited experience in healthcare. Also, Thursday, we're going to see two big confirmation hearings. Kash Patel, he is up to lead the FBI, and Tulsi Gabbard has been nominated to be the Director of National Intelligence. So, Moshe, all three of those should be pretty fascinating this week.
Yeah, the Kennedy one is interesting because not only are there Democrats concerned about him, but also some Democrats that might be into him. But then you have the Republicans who also don't like the fact that as the head of HHS, you have basically a pro-choice guy determining aspects of abortion policy in the country. So you have seen some more of the social conservatives saying, we don't trust him on those issues. So it's a very interesting group here that could come together to potentially bring down RFK Jr. Again, there's the vaccine stuff, the anti-establishment stuff, the experience stuff, the belief in various theories out there, as well as concern from the right about his various liberal viewpoints, because until last year, he was a Democrat and still holds some of those views. So then you have the two other hearings you brought up. Kash Patel, a well-known Trump loyalist here, vocal critic of the FBI, accusing them of bias. You know, he's constantly talking about the deep state. He's talked about turning FBI headquarters into a museum. Extremely critical to the point where he's written kids' books where he's a wizard helping out King Donald against enemies like Kamala and Hillary. Again, the concern here is that since Nixon, there's been a push to make the FBI director apolitical. The concern here is that this sort of restores the J. Edgar Hoover era of making for a very political, loyalist type FBI director. And so we'll watch here. Right now, Republicans look like they're going to get Patel through, but it really depends on how he handles the hearing on Thursday. In most trouble here, one would argue, is Tulsi Gabbard, former Democratic Congresswoman, 2020 presidential candidate. On the Democrat side, she then switched to the Republican side. She would oversee the intelligence community, but she's been criticized by a number of Republicans, in addition to Democrats, for parroting a pro-Putin line, a pro-Russia propaganda line after the invasion of Ukraine. There's been a lot of talk about this visit she made to Syria several years ago and her affinity or closeness for the former Syrian dictator Bashar Assad. The bottom line is, based on the McConnell, Collins, Murkowski, those three Republicans, if they also stand firm against these other Republican nominees, again, it just takes one more Republican to potentially bring down a nominee here. So we'll be watching those hearings closely and bring you the recap later this week.
Meanwhile, President Trump continues to sign sweeping executive orders and make major changes inside of the federal government. In a Friday night purge, Trump fired more than a dozen independent federal government watchdogs known as inspectors general. Inspectors general are tasked with getting rid of government waste, fraud, and abuse. That's one of Trump's stated goals. But he has remained suspicious of federal government officials who he blames with blocking actions during his first term in office. The concern is that these inspectors general are meant to investigate agencies and call out issues, even if it makes the White House look bad. Trump's move is an attempt to assert control over the federal government in this term. He fired at least a dozen inspectors general at the Departments of State, Agriculture, Interior, Transportation, Housing and Urban Development, Education, Labor and Defense, as well as the Small Business Administration and the EPA. The inspectors general were notified by emails from the White House personnel director that they had been terminated immediately late Friday night. The dismissals appeared to violate federal law, which requires Congress receive 30 days notice of any intent to fire a Senate-confirmed inspector general. And Moshe, notably, most of these were appointed during the first Trump administration.
Yeah, a number of these were his people. But as we know, that sometimes he sours on them. Some of the people he fired actually surprised even Democrats who, some of these inspectors general are people that Democrats didn't like, who they already felt were too loyal to Trump, but Trump is cleaning house. And again, the president has the right to fire these folks. It's just the style, the manner in which he did it, given the law, which says you need to give Congress a heads up here since Congress confirms these people, and they like to keep some autonomy here. Now, keep in mind, Inspector General, there's one for each of these departments. And what do? They investigate the department and its actions. So the concern here is that he'll appoint people that'll be less scrutinizing or less critical of things that he'll do in each department because they're there to look at, hey, the department sort of went awry here, or I suggest that we do stuff in a different way, and this was handled inappropriately. And so, again, the concern here is that he'll appoint some loyalists. Jill, it's remarkable. Lindsey Graham was asked about this over on CBS over the weekend, and he has always been very critical of presidents messing with inspectors general. But, of course, he's a big Trump fan. So he's asked about the law, saying, hey, weren't you supposed to get a 30-day heads up? And he's like, yeah, it's probably true that the president broke the law here, but it doesn't matter. Trump should be able to do what he wants to do in his administration. So you're seeing sort of this continued deference from Republicans on Capitol Hill, whereas, say, Joe Biden had done this and you would have heard a different tune, and vice versa for Democrats. So those are just a few of the headlines. We got a couple others coming back in the speed read here of what we've been trying to track this weekend.
Moving on to the Middle East, over the weekend, the latest exchange took place between Israel and Hamas in the ongoing ceasefire. 4 Israeli hostages were released from Hamas captivity in Gaza, and 200 Palestinian prisoners were set free from Israeli jails. The 4 hostages were all female soldiers that were kidnapped on October 7th. They are 20-year-old Karina Ariev, 20-year-old Daniela Gilboa, 20-year-old Nama Levy, and 19-year-old Liri Albag. They were reunited with their parents at an Israeli military base after 477 days in captivity. Israeli officials said that they were malnourished but in stable condition, calling their medical condition complex, both physically and emotionally. Initial reports about their conditions in Gaza were also released. The women reportedly told officials that they went for long periods without being able to shower and without sanitary conditions or proper medical treatment. They were often starved. One was held alone in a tunnel for a long time. They were moved around Gaza a lot during their 15 months in captivity, some held in the homes of Gazan civilians for periods of time. Moshe, and then there was the dramatic and kind of bizarre transfer from Hamas hands over to the Red Cross.
Yeah, they made a whole show of it in Gaza. Hamas terrorists covered up, faces covered, parading the hostages through a crowd of thousands of people, brought onto a stage where they made the Red Cross sign for them. The stage, by the way, had like a printed out step and repeat backdrop with terms like Nazi Zionism, Palestinian fighters will always be the victors, Gaza is the graveyard of the criminal Zionists. They made the hostages wear makeshift military uniforms. They even gave them goodie bags with things that they want them to remember from their 477 days in captivity, almost like a Hunger Games quality to all of it. People were asking over on the Instagram account over the weekend why the hostages were smiling or waving on stage. My response to that is, if you're being released after 477 days in captivity, you will do whatever it takes to make sure you get home alive. Whatever Hamas tells you to do, you will do. We're still waiting to, hear from these women. I imagine we might not hear from some of them for a very long time, given just how long they were held in captivity and the various trauma that they experienced. But ultimately here, Israeli officials, applauded the hostages on, projecting the confidence and calm that it took to make sure that they were handed over to the Red Cross and able to be freed over the weekend.
So this handover was part of the first stage of a ceasefire deal with Hamas that will see the hostages released in waves over a 6-week period. In exchange, Israel released 200 Palestinian prisoners, some of whom have been locked up for decades, and 2/3 of which were involved in terror attacks that killed dozens of Israelis. Most were returned to homes in the West Bank or Gaza, but 70 of them who had been convicted in the worst crimes were deported to other Arab countries as part of the agreement. Crowds of Palestinians gathered in Ramallah in the West Bank to welcome dozens of prisoners who arrived on buses to return home.
Yeah, and you can see chants, pro-Hamas chants, cheers for Hamas there. It's a remarkable thing given where we are at the war and what has transpired there, especially in Gaza, that you do continue to see the support there. It was notable, two of the Palestinian prisoners who were in Israeli prison actually refused to board the bus, saying we actually would rather stay in prison. One eventually agreed to go. One actually said, no, I don't want to go back to Gaza. I will stay in Israeli prison. So he was swapped out.
That was one of those headlines where you're like, plot twist. What?
They're like, are you sure? And he's like, no, I'm pretty sure I want to stay here. And so I don't know the details there or, what his experience was with Hamas, but clearly he fears potentially going back, given whatever he has said or whatever he's done in prison or God knows. Anyway, we do know that so far as part of this phase one, we're several weeks into this. We're a week or so into this. Ultimately, this is a 6-week phase, and they're negotiating phase 2 right now. Hamas has agreed to release 33 of the nearly 100 hostages during this phase. 7 have been released so far. We're supposed to be getting the names and the state of the remaining hostages. Some are alive, some are dead. And so we'll wait to hear that. And then, of course, Hamas has made certain demands for each hostage and how many prisoners they get in return here. Like, as you noted, the 4 Israelis released over the weekend, Hamas demanded 50 individuals for each of them. And that is what transpired. And so we're going to continue to watch this. And this is very touch and go here, as there are a lot of claims from the Israeli side that Hamas isn't keeping to their side of the bargain, and then claims from the Hamas side that the Israelis are not keeping to their end of the bargain.
On Saturday, Trump weighed in on the conflict and what he sees as the future for Palestinians. He told reporters that he wants the countries of Jordan, Egypt, and other Arab nations to accept more Palestinian refugees from the Gaza Strip. He called Gaza literally a demolition site right now and said that he would rather build housing in other Arab countries and, quote, clean out Gaza after it being ravaged from 15 months of war. Trump said he discussed this vision on separate calls with the King of Jordan and the President of Egypt. However, the idea was quickly rejected by Jordan, and Egypt has previously spoken out against any such suggestions. Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas condemned the idea, and a Hamas official has said that they would never agree to that.
Yeah, this is one of those ideas that it's unclear where this will go. But ultimately, Trump said this on aboard Air Force One over the weekend while he was flying back from LA, where he was looking at the aftermath there. He sort of just threw it out there as an idea. 1.5 million Palestinians leaving Gaza. Again, it's unclear whether that's the number that he actually thought about. There are about 2.5 million Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, but we've already said that, based on the destruction there that this war has wrought and the Israeli bombing, et cetera, Gaza's looking at decades to rebuild itself. So ultimately, there is a reality check here, but ultimately a lot of concern over the fact that, the U.S. president is saying, hey, let's clear the place out, maybe, for good as it rebuilds. And then you have the neighboring countries that have been very reluctant to take in refugees until now. Palestinians have had to pay a lot of money to try to get out of Gaza into Egypt. Jordan itself is about 70 to 80% Palestinian already. The king is not Palestinian, so he's worried about taking on even more Palestinians in the country and that monarchy. It's not a democracy. And then Egypt sees the Palestinians as a source of instability in the same way that Jordan would see additional Palestinians as a source of instability. for that government. Historically, Palestinian militant groups, terror groups have also challenged at times governments in the Arab world, tried to topple the governments in Jordan. The current king's father faced war from the Palestinians internally back in the 70s. They tried to topple the government in Lebanon. So there's a lot of historical issues here that would prevent this from happening. Nonetheless, Trump is throwing a lot of ideas out there, and we are hitting the stage soon of how the rebuilding is going to go, who's going to pay for it, how this will all transpire. So, be alert to the fact that there'll be a lot of ideas thrown around. Unclear which of them will actually take.
Time for the speed read from the New York Times. A major headline out of the CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia this weekend, as the agency updated its assessment of the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic. Trump's new CIA director, John Ratcliffe, declassifying and making public a new analysis that points a finger at an accidental Wuhan, China lab leak as the origin of COVID. The CIA analysis was actually done at the tail end of the Biden administration, and the new Trump team is now releasing it. A CIA spokesperson said in a statement that the CIA assesses with low confidence that a research-related origin of the COVID-19 pandemic is more likely than a natural origin. This is based on the available body of reporting. The competing theories have been that the outbreak either originated from one of two locations. It's been debated for more than 5 years now. So those locations are: one, a wet market where an infected animal came into contact with humans. So that's called natural origin. Or two, that the virus leaked from a high security lab that creates dangerous viruses for research purposes in Wuhan. There is no new evidence that led to the CIA assessment. Instead of new evidence, though, this conclusion was based on a fresh analysis of intelligence about the spread of the virus, its scientific properties, and the work and conditions of China's virology labs. Again, these conclusions came from a review ordered by the Biden administration, but released this week by Ratcliffe.
Yes, and a reminder here that the CIA is just one of 18 intelligence agencies we have in the U.S. government. It's not just the CIA. We have the DIA over at Defense. Energy has an intelligence agency. DHS has one. State has one. And so on and so forth. Each of them have been doing their own assessments here and own analyses. Remember early on, any claims that it was the Wuhan lab, people were labeled as misinformation and disinformation, but it turns out here that the lab and the wet market, just a few miles apart there in Wuhan, and there have been, two schools of thought here, but especially in the last couple of years here, increasing assessment over at the FBI, the Department of Energy, and now at the CIA. Again, the CIA says that with low confidence, nonetheless, their analysis says it's more likely that it looks like it came out of this institute. The Wuhan Institute was engaged in increasingly risky experiments with coronaviruses. It was gathering them from bat caves in southern China. They were engaged at times in what's called gain of function research, which is modifying viruses to actually make them more infectious. The positive idea behind gain of function is that it can contribute to identifying risks and create countermeasures and vaccines. So let's see what we can do to these viruses. But again, there's a lot of people in the science world that aren't a fan of gain of function research. So now, you have several parts of the U.S. government that say it was probably the lab here. The issue we have faced fundamentally, Jill, is that China isn't cooperating. A number of people who knew stuff have gone missing. And so the U.S. intelligence agencies, as well as some others around the world, are trying their best based on available evidence, based on what they can glean, to try to get at ultimately the thing that changed our world most significantly in this century. And we're still dealing with the fallout from it. And so it's super important that we get to the bottom of it. But will we? Unclear. But the CIA assessment certainly got a lot of attention over the weekend.
All right, from NPR, President Trump said this weekend that he was in talks with multiple people over buying TikTok and would likely have a decision on the popular app's future within the next 30 days. NPR reports that the Trump administration is working on a plan to save TikTok that involves tapping software company Oracle and a group of outside investors. They would effectively take control of the app's global operations. Under the deal being discussed, TikTok's China-based owner ByteDance would retain a minority majority stake in the company, but the app's algorithm, data collection, and software updates will be overseen by Oracle. Notably, Oracle, a US-based company, already provides the foundation of TikTok's web infrastructure. That would effectively mean American investors would own a majority stake in TikTok. However, the terms of the deal could change and are still being hammered out.
Yeah, there's still a lot to figure out here. Other potential investors include Microsoft. A reminder, back when Trump tried to ban TikTok the first time, back when he was into banning TikTok, he's not so much into banning it anymore, but he's dealing with the ramifications of the law passed during Biden last year. There was actually a negotiation with Oracle and Walmart at the time to try to get them to own TikTok. Walmart, it looks like, is sitting out this go around. Oracle still interested. Their CEO, Larry Ellison, was over at the White House last week on that AI announcement that Trump made in terms of creating new AI infrastructure and investment in the country, but also interested in a TikTok stake here. So we'll see if this meets the requirements of the congressional bill here and how we work this out, because ultimately right now, technically, it is against the law right now, TikTok, but Trump has pushed this off as he tries to negotiate a deal. A number of big finance types, KKR, Sequoia Capital, others involved in this. There has been talk that Mr. Beast of YouTube fame was going to get involved here, but it looks like he's not, at least not in this group.
And even more news from the White House, this time from the Financial Times. Donald Trump said this weekend that he believes the U.S. will take control of Greenland, the world's largest island. It comes after details emerged of what's being described by some European leaders as, quote, a horrendous call in which he made economic threats to Denmark. Greenland is a territory of Denmark's and has been for 500 years. Denmark and Greenland say the territory not on the market. Speaking on board Air Force One on Saturday, Trump said, I think we're going to have it, and claimed that the Arctic island's 57,000 residents want to be with us. Trump adding, I do believe Greenland will get, because it really has to do with the freedom of the world. Since his reelection, Trump has reiterated his interest in acquiring the Arctic island, which is, again, controlled by Denmark, but it does have a large degree of autonomy. Moshe, is there any way that this happens?
Jill, I think even the Danes, when they had this call, the prime minister had the call in recent days, were like, this is just Trump, talking. Trump clearly just wants some more military bases or drilling rights or something in Greenland. And apparently after this phone call, they're like, oh, I think he actually might invade Greenland here, or really make it difficult for us, because he really, really wants it. A number of European leaders telling the Financial Times it was a horrendous call. They called it a cold shower. We got to take this very seriously. They're freaking out right now in Denmark about all of this. Greenland's prime minister actually wants independence from Denmark, but he's like, we're not for sale. We would become an independent country. We're not interested in becoming the 51st state here. Ultimately, there's a lot of interest from Trump's end here, but the U.S. doesn't really have a legal claim to Greenland. Denmark is a fellow member of NATO, so this is a conflict with a fellow NATO military alliance member. So this is leading to a lot of questions. Again, I cannot imagine, the Marines landing on Greenland, invading a country that's just the precedent that sets globally would not be good. As the U.S. tries to deter other countries from just taking pieces of land. Nonetheless, Trump is particularly interested in Greenland, as right now there's a rapid melting of the ice sheets and the glaciers up there. So there's an interest in the oil drilling, the essential minerals that are now available in Greenland, like copper, lithium, cobalt, nickel, a lot of rare earth minerals there. Also, the Arctic ice is melting, so there's new shipping routes around Greenland. The U.S. already has a base there. But again, Denmark was open to hey, we'll let you have more bases. But apparently the way the phone call went was Trump's like, no, but I want it. I want the whole thing. So we'll watch. This is certainly not something that came up on the campaign trail, but has been something he's been talking about a lot. And finally here from CBS Sports, the Super Bowl matchup is final. The two teams who will be facing off in Super Bowl 59 in just about 2 weeks here. Couple of familiar names, the Kansas City Chiefs and the Philadelphia Eagles. In fact, Super Bowl 59 here will be a repeat of the matchup we just saw 2 years ago in Super Bowl 57 with the Eagles and Chiefs playing in New Orleans on February 9th. The Chiefs are looking to make history this time. They won in 23, they won in 2024, and they're looking to become the first NFL team in history to win 3 Super Bowls in a row. It was a close matchup in the AFC Championship game as the Chiefs tried to make their third straight Super Bowl here. Kansas City and Buffalo coming down to the end of the fourth quarter. Kansas City pulling off a huge defensive stop against the Buffalo Bills. A huge disappointment for Bills fans. I know a number of you. I feel for you. The Bills, one of those teams that have never won a Super Bowl. In fact, they went to the Super Bowl 4 straight times back in the 90s, lost all 4 times. The issue in facing the Chiefs, you got to play near perfect to beat Patrick Mahomes, Travis Kelce, and the squad there. And coming down to the end there, the Chiefs were able to pull it out. So the Chiefs are in it, looking to make history. They'll face the Eagles. The Eagles had a much easier time in their NFC Championship game, demolishing the Washington Commanders 55-23. It's a new record, actually, for the most points scored in an NFC Championship game. This will be the Eagles' 5th ever Super Bowl appearance, and their 2nd, as I noted, in just a matter of 3 years here. Just 2 years ago, they lost a very close game to the Chiefs, so they're looking for revenge this time. And like Buffalo, the Washington fan base, very disappointed. They've lost for a very long time. This was the furthest they've made it. They were once called the Redskins. Now they're called the Commanders. And there were high hopes in D.C. that they would make it to the Super Bowl. Nonetheless, the Super Bowl, Kansas City and Philly again, happening Sunday, February 9th, 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time in the Superdome in New Orleans. This site has hosted more Super Bowls than any other stadium. This will be the 11th time New Orleans hosts Super Bowl here. The halftime performance, for those of you interested, Kendrick Lamar, joined by SZA, and we'll see if there's any other special guests that make an appearance there. But Super Bowl 2 weeks from now, and again, we'll see if the Kansas City Chiefs can make history or Philly can pull their revenge. All right, now finally we end here with On This Day in History. We should begin by noting that January 27th is International Holocaust Remembrance Day. On this day in 1945, Soviet troops liberated the Nazi concentration camps of Auschwitz and Birkenau in Poland.
Moshe, one thing that I learned when I went on the March of the Living, which is a trip where you go with Holocaust survivors and students to some of the concentration camps, if you see anybody, any survivors, and unfortunately there's so few left, but if you see any of them with the tattoo, the number tattoo, that only happened in Auschwitz and Birkenau. That wasn't something that was done in all of the camps. So that means that was done there. And when you go to visit in person, I think one thing that struck me was how massive it is. I mean, it's as far as the eye can see, just barracks upon barracks that held prisoners, for the most part, Jewish prisoners, with so many ultimately being killed. Yeah,
1.3 million people estimated to have been sent to Auschwitz, 1.1 million of them murdered in just a couple of years there. On this day in 1973, the Vietnam Peace Accords were signed in Paris, ending direct U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. And we end here with a bit of pop culture history. On this day in 1984, Michael Jackson's hair caught fire while filming a Pepsi commercial, a terrible incident. In fact, Jill, he would start to take painkillers in the aftermath of that, and then that would lead to his eventual issues, addiction issues, etc., that he would deal with for the rest of his life. A bit of Super Bowl history on this day in 1991. Whitney Houston delivers her iconic performance of the national anthem at the Super Bowl. Just an incredible voice there, and another artist that we lost way too soon.
Moshe, I'd have to think that is the number one of all time singing of the national anthem, right?
Right.
I mean,
I think you can have a debate about the halftime shows and what you think is the best halftime show, but I think the national anthem, hands down, goes to Whitney Houston. It was also quite a moment because the U.S. Had just started the Persian Gulf War, the first one, to push Iraq out of Kuwait. So just there was a lot of symbolism in that moment there on this day in 1991. And finally, another iconic musician, Cyndi Lauper, releases Time After Time on this day in 1984.
All right, Moshe, it is time to wrap. Thank you, everyone, for listening to the Mo News Podcast. If you like what you hear, please share this with your friends. It will help us grow. Follow us and subscribe so you don't miss an episode. And review us in the App Store. We'd appreciate it. And as we were mentioning at the top, we hope that you leave this podcast, despite what's going on in the world, feeling good, not feeling stressed. We hope we are turning the temperature down a bit.
Armed with facts. Always super important.
All right. Bye, everyone.